I get excited about Easter. I've been thinking about this for months. And it's not because I just think about preaching all the time, because I don't, frankly. I think about it when I'm preparing a sermon, and when I'm not preparing a sermon, I don't think about preaching. I think about other things. Yesterday I was thinking about donuts, in fact, and they were good. But you watch a video like that, I mean, the nails to the hand moment turning into a crown, that gets you. I've been thinking about this for months, not because I've been preparing a sermon, but because of the reality of the resurrection in my own life. There's power there. And it becomes more real the more I look into it and the more I study it. And the more I begin to live it, what the resurrection means. And that's really what we're talking about today. A couple months ago, as I was thinking about this, I ran into a video and really a research project by Lifeway Research. They're really a publishing group, Christian publishing group. But Ed Stetzer, the president or executive director of Lifeway Research, was presenting some information they had found in one of their studies. And the video is particularly interesting as he kind of dissects all these different, very interesting things they found out as they did a poll with unchurched people in their 20s. So unchurched 20-somethings. And you can see on the screen there are two particularly interesting things among a whole lot of things that he pointed out. But among those who have no church affiliation, whether or not they grew up in a church is a different matter, but they don't go to church now and they're in their 20s. They found that 66% of that category of people believe Jesus died and rose again. That's 2/3 of people who are not connected with the church in their 20s. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? They would believe that Jesus died and rose again. 77 of those say that believing in Jesus makes a positive impact in a person's life. Again, pretty remarkable numbers when you come down to it. But Stetzer made an interesting comment, especially about the 66%. He said, if I thought there was a guy who was dead on Friday and then Sunday not so much, I'm going with that guy. But 66% haven't stepped over that line. That's a very interesting number, isn't it? There's an openness to Jesus Christ, is what he discovered. And he said it's very wide open in the 20s, and as you go up in the age scale, it gets narrower and narrower, that openness. Church, we have an opportunity, first of all. And what's been done is not a rejection of Jesus, but a rejection of the church. And that's a topic for another day, but if you've been here long enough, you know that I talk about that a lot, so you know that day will come sooner rather than later. But the thing is, we're going to read from John 20 in a moment, the next part after what Pastor Bob read. And I do encourage you to find it. Find John 20. You can read it in the Bible in front of you. Mobile device, YouVersion, live event is set up if you use that. We'll get there in just a moment. We're looking particularly at the witness of Mary Magdalene as she comes to the empty tomb. And if you recognize something when we read that, it's this. Mary's faith was not automatic in what happened. She comes, she sees the evidence, and she still needs to process what in the world is going on around me. It takes processing to figure out what's happened, and then she makes a step towards a new reality. And that's what I see in the statistics here. I see that there's, we know the event, but there needs to be a processing after that to say, okay, what now? What do we do with this information? I proclaim, and I stand with the church on this, that on Easter morning 2,000 years ago, the tomb was empty, and Jesus had come back to life. That's what the church has been saying since the event happened. I proclaim that and believe that this morning. The tomb was empty. Jesus rose again from the dead. And what I want to get at this morning is the fact that the tomb actually was empty and that we shouldn't try and fill it again. But that there's life in the resurrection. There's life for you and me found in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. A full tomb leads to an empty life. An empty tomb leads to a full life because of the resurrection. That's where we're going this morning. Now, one more sort of procedural note before we get to John 20. Let's talk about why Jesus died and what happens leading up to that. And that'll walk us right up to John 20. First of all, as scholars look at it, as you look at the text of the New Testament, there are all kinds of things that Jesus, remember he's a Jewish man, and he's kind of running into the Jewish religious leaders, so in a lot of ways it's like an internal conflict in the look of things. One of the major issues, they had all kinds of issues. He's raising people from the dead, he's performing signs, he's teaching things they didn't like, but the big issue was when Jesus came into the temple, and he made a big scene in the temple, the center point of Jewish worship, the thing that was controlled by a lot of Jewish leaders, religious leaders. They didn't like that. That was sort of the precipitating event as people look at what happened. But they couldn't kill Jesus, so they handed him over to the Roman authorities, and ultimately it becomes a political issue for them, because this guy's claimed to be a rival king, somebody who's rivaling Caesar. So that warrants putting him to death. So it's this religious issue, it's this political issue that puts Jesus on the cross ultimately, at least in the basic sense. Now, prior to getting to John 20 and finding the empty tomb, Jesus has had his Last Supper with his disciples, where he reminds them, love one another as I have loved you. And then he's about to show them what that looks like. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays, he's agonizing over what comes next. He's then betrayed by one of his own, and then he's taken to 2 different trials. We're kind of merging all the stories together that we see in the Gospels here. 2 different trials, one of which was, we'll just say it was not fully legal the way it was done. And then he's handed over to the Roman authorities where it's kind of just awkward, frankly. And from that second trial, he's taken to be flogged. And I just want to enter us into the story. Roman flogging was virtually a death sentence. That's what's happening at this point. When people were flogged by the Romans, if you've seen Passion of the Christ, it may get some things right, it may get some things wrong, but one thing it gets right is that practice of flogging and crucifixion was absolutely brutal. And just the sheer blood loss alone of a Roman flogging could kill a person. And Jesus comes out of that, and then what happens next? He's beaten. And then what happens next? He can't even make it carrying the crossbeam to where he's supposed to be nailed to wood that's probably not been sanded down. And he's hung on the cross to die. In the sunlight, humiliating, weakened, the most painful death you could possibly imagine. He's buried in a tomb, and everybody thinks game over at that point. And then what happens? The tomb is empty. And that's where we pick up the story in John 20. We're going to read 11 through 18. It won't be on the screen because it's a little too much for that. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me, where have you put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. An important detail that we need to look at right away is that Mary most likely was walking to the tomb with other women. If you look at the earlier passage we read from John, even though it says Mary, she runs back and tells Peter, and she says, "We went there. We saw this." The other testimonies of the Gospels show us that other women were with her. Why were they going together? They were going to prepare a body that had been put in a tomb rather hastily. So that tells us something very important. They didn't expect the tomb to be empty. They expected it to be very full with something that needed to be done. That's why they went there. And Mary gets there, and she's confronted with some interesting facts. There's 2 angels sitting there. There's a guy that she mistakes for the gardener, and she looks at and says, "Where's the body?" And what holds Mary back from belief is her worldview, quite honestly. It's not the facts that hold her back at that point. You know, grave robbery was not uncommon in the day, even though it would have been kind of weird with this particular circumstance. If you read all the accounts, there were guards there. It would have been kind of difficult in this case, but not out of purview. So she comes in, well, maybe the body's gone. Gardener, if you took it, give it back, wherever it is. We'll take it. She's trying to piece things together with what she has before her and the worldview that she has. No one expected that the Messiah was going to die in the first place. They especially didn't expect that he was going to rise again from the dead. If you go and look at John 20, verse 9, this is after Peter and John had come running to the tomb, and Peter boldly jumps in there and looks in, and John's a little more reticent, kind of peeks in after the fact. They saw that there was something going on, but even in parentheses, in verse 9 it says, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise again from the dead. Nobody expected this. That was not part of their worldview. And so Mary's worldview holds her back from the facts that are before her. The tomb is empty. She figures it out. It's even Jesus. But even then, it's like, wait a minute. What do I do with this? And Jesus helps her along. And as I mentioned this worldview, let's just be clear what I'm saying. Worldview is the assumptions that we bring to the world around us, to how the world works, and that affects how we function in the world. And we can narrow it down to two simple parts when we talk about worldview. It's the first part, how the world works, right? Our assumptions about that. But the second part is our place in the world. How much we take up in that and what sort of our proportion is to the world around us. How we perceive ourselves in that world. Mary has here a sort of a worldview conflict. So do the disciples. All these facts are around her, but they don't add up to how she perceives the world to work. I had an experience like this, just to give you a different example. Years ago, I took a trip to New Mexico. I was going camping with friends in the Guadalupe Mountains. We stopped in Roswell. I don't know if you've had the privilege of stopping there. But we saw the UFO Museum and all those interesting things that you're supposed to see in Roswell. And we went into all the little gift shops, and you can buy the Mulder and Scully badges and the alien dolls and all that are there. And in one of them, the owner calls us over. He's like, hey, come here. He's kind of a shady-looking guy. And he calls us over, and he gets out this old magazine of the Roswell incident, right, to show us how they got on the map. And in the midst, he just seamlessly transitioned into when he and his son were abducted by aliens. Just seamlessly gets into it. And you had a worldview conflict all of a sudden. Okay, we're talking two different worlds here. That's what Mary's facing right now. It's that much of a big conflict going on. This doesn't add up, what's going on. The tomb was empty. I like history a lot. I, in fact, have a degree in history, and I've run into numerous times the assumption that people bring that people who lived a long time ago were not as smart as we are today. That's what we assume quite often. We come to a story like this, and we're like, well, obviously people could accept that a guy could come back to life because they were all mythologically oriented in this and that and the other and believed in spirits and whatever. No, they still believe that dead people remained dead 2,000 years ago, just like we do today. They very much believed that. That's why this is a shock to the system. Dead people don't come back to life, and they believed that, but something happened. Something happened on that day, and it's acknowledged even by friend and foe that something happened with the tomb. And because of worldview, we're often held back, just like people were back then. Worldview, how the assumptions about how the world worked. Dead people stay dead. Messiahs don't die. That's not victory, that's defeat. Something went wrong here. And so, within the scholarly world of Jesus, there have been a lot of people over the last 100+ years who have been trying to put Jesus back in the tomb. Maybe there never was an empty tomb. Maybe it was full. There have been people who have been trying to deny the resurrection happened. There are people who try and say, well, it might matter, but, it doesn't really matter that much, even if it happened. And we sometimes, it's that second part of worldview, we sometimes have an assumption and an estimation of ourselves. and where we are in the world, especially compared to God, that's a little too big and out of proportion. Because if the resurrection happened, it's a bold claim and it means a lot. It's a huge thing if it happened. Last summer, it was a nice warm day. It's an evening, and I have 3 kids. Our youngest is a boy. He had just turned 2. Stephanie, my wife, and the 2 older ones were out doing something, and so it's just this beautiful night. And I grabbed the little guy, and I said, let's take a walk. So I put him in the stroller. Now, he's a 2-year-old boy, and 2-year-old boys like, cars, trucks, planes, trains, and they don't walk, they run, and they crash into things and destroy our furniture. That's 2-year-old boys, right? And so we live near a fire station, and he has toy fire trucks. Every so often the fire truck goes in front of the house, not typically with the sirens going as much as coming back from a call. And so when the fire truck is small, that's pretty fun, right? You can control that. That's exciting. When it goes in front of the house, you're far enough removed from it that it's not such a big deal. And the sirens aren't going, it's going by slow, but it's moving. So we take a walk around the block, beautiful summer evening. Sun's starting to set, but it's just the right light. And we come next to the fire station, the door's wide open, and we're like 20 yards, if even that, away from that wide open door with the fire truck right there. And I turn and I say, hey, do you want to go up and see it? His eyes get wide. No. Because the fire truck's huge to a 2-year-old boy when you're that close. He wanted to get no closer to that. And I think when we start to consider the ramifications and reality of the resurrection, we have to have a slightly smaller estimate of ourselves in order to do that. It's a massive event. And quite often it's too easy to pass it by or let it just be like the fire truck driving by. And whether it's ignorance, arrogance, or pride, we sometimes perceive God as much smaller than God is and ourselves as much bigger in the world than we are. But something happened. And I'm going to give you 2 actionable points today. And the first is this. We need to find the empty tomb. It doesn't matter to me where you are on the spectrum of faith, if you've been following Jesus Christ for 50 years, or if you don't know Jesus Christ, or even if you count this all as silliness. Find the empty tomb is actually a challenge I'm giving you today. Mary tells Peter, who tells John, they run. They have this little foot race that John chronicles for us. They get there. Peter steps in, and then they leave, not realizing that Jesus is supposed to rise after 3 days. And Mary's stuck there with the angels, crying, and she's utterly lost, even in the midst of the fact she's crying. What now? What next? There's no body. And like I said, for a long time, people have been trying to put Jesus back in the tomb, or they've been trying to explain this away or try and make heads or tails of this. Mary does the exact same thing before she comes to some other conclusions. But we kind of wrestle with it. How could this even happen? So some claim, for instance, that, well, maybe Jesus didn't die at all, right? I just read before this service, there's a verse in the Quran, in the Muslim world. It states it in the Quran that Jesus didn't die. It was just a trick, some people say. Some people say maybe he swooned on the cross. I heard a fanciful theory this week that's been around for a while that Pontius Pilate really didn't want Jesus dead in the first place, so he put him on the cross to make it look like he was going to die and then took him off. Or people say, well, then maybe Jesus was drugged, or whatever it is. They try and explain that maybe Jesus didn't really die. But you have to face some facts on that one. Romans were experts at killing. That's what they did. Those Roman soldiers that put him on the cross, that was their job. And if they didn't do their job with a common criminal, which is what Jesus was, then they might have been up there. Or they might have been killed themselves. That's dereliction of duty. Besides that, a bloodied, beaten Jesus is not really going to inspire people to follow him. He's not going to inspire them and say, oh, I was resurrected, even though I can barely walk. That's not going to work. Sources, both Roman and Jewish, when you get into the historical sources, attest to the fact that this guy died. So it's there in the history. Not only that, people are trying to explain the empty tomb, even if you go to the Bible itself in Matthew 28. It'll come up on the screen. the Jewish religious leaders are trying to figure out what to do with this. And Matthew tells us about this. It says, while the women were on their way, they just discovered the empty tomb. Some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Not only that, it gets transitioned later on in history to Judas the gardener, is what this guy gets named, took the body. So they kind of merge together some stories. People start circulating that later on in history. And even beyond that, people were claiming resurrection from the beginning. Had there not been a resurrection, the Jewish religious leaders could have produced a body if they had a body, but they didn't. That's the problem. History attests time and again that Jesus actually died. That's what happened. Of course, people then say, well, maybe it was the wrong tomb. They would have figured it out. People say, well, maybe they were hallucinating. There were mass hallucinations. We heard from 1 Corinthians this morning that Jesus appeared to the disciples, then to 500 brothers and sisters, then to Paul as one abnormally born. Well, people have pretty well put to rest that hallucinations couldn't have happened like that. Maybe they had a spiritual experience. People say, well, that's putting more of a modern term on an ancient way of doing things. Maybe they just saw ghosts, but they had language for talking about ghosts, and they didn't use that language. And then, of course, people just say, well, maybe they're biased accounts. Of course they are. Every history is a biased account. Every picture that you take with your smartphone is a biased account. Take it 10 feet to the right or to the left, and you have a completely different picture, and it leaves out more than it tells you, doesn't it? What we do is biased. And it's interesting that if you read the Gospels, what do we get from those? Just to name a couple details. Women are the first witnesses of the risen Christ. You would never do that in the ancient world if you wanted it to be credible. Women weren't admissible in court. They weren't trusted as witnesses, and yet they're the first ones. You have the disciples who don't even believe. They're in hiding. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that point to the fact that this is not simply fabricated, but something actually happened. It really did. And we come down to the fact that what we're really looking at is a historical question, not a scientific question, right? Because nobody's claiming that Jesus came back to life from natural back to life causes. The claim is that Jesus came back to life because God raised him from the dead. It's not a scientific question. I have no problem with science. I like it a lot. But as a biblical theologian N.T. Wright points out, science studies the repeatable, history studies the unrepeatable. This is an unrepeatable event. The question isn't, can this happen? The question is, did this happen? And the historical record keeps pointing back that the straightest line is that something happened. The tomb was empty, and nobody has a good explanation. And all the explanations that are alternate don't seem to make a straight line. They have to reach very far. The facts point to resurrection. It's a thumbnail sketch of all that's out there. There's plenty out there on that. But why is this worth the effort, really? And you can see a quote up here from, again, biblical theologian N.T. Wright. He says, "Take Christmas away, and in biblical terms, you lose 2 chapters at the front of Matthew and Luke. Nothing else. Take Easter away, and you don't have a New Testament. You don't have a Christianity." The resurrection has to be considered because it's such a massive claim. It's a huge claim. You want to know one way that the resurrection has affected you already today? You're here. There'd be no church if the resurrection didn't happen. You wouldn't be sitting in this room. You've been affected even in the most benign way by being here. I don't know if you're happy about that or not, but you're here because of the resurrection. It's got to be considered and investigated to the fullness. It's huge. You think it through. God, the claim is, came to earth as a human. That's a big claim right there. In near obscurity, in a corner of the world that was under the control of somebody else. and then was killed by that superpower, that world superpower, a violent death on the cross, was buried, and then rose again from the dead, and we're still talking about it today. This is a pretty big claim, isn't it? That God came in human form and died on a cross. And a church grew up out of this historical moment, and that church has given launch to hospitals and orphanages and all kinds of charitable and amazing things that have gone on in the world. Monasteries, art, music, history, not history, they've created a lot of history. Art, music, all kinds of things have come out of this. Lives, civilizations have been profoundly altered by this pivotal moment. You can't take that for granted. And you can't just pass it by without due consideration. Actual consideration of the historical event and the historical moment. But all too often we stop short of processing that event. Quite frankly, I think we're much more satisfied watching cat videos on YouTube than thinking resurrection. I love a good cat video. They're wonderful. They're delightful. They're cute. I can't believe cats can fit in such small spaces. But we spend more time doing that. We spend more time on the profane and the meaningless than we do on this moment in history that has such a remarkable effect on us even today and calls so much of us. The second actionable point I give you this morning is that we need to find life in resurrection. And I'm going to give you one other scripture this morning from verses 5 through 10. Paul says, "For if we have been united with him in a death like this, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. Because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. For we know that since Christ was raised from the dead, he cannot die again. Death no longer has mastery over him. The death he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God." For the past few weeks around here, we've been talking about the fact that we went back to Ephesians 2, that we sort of have two different ways that we can be in this life. And by default, we are selfish people who live in sin. That is, we live contrary to what God would have us do and who God would have us be, by default. We might do good things, and we might call them for the greater good, but when you get down to it, it's very arbitrary why we would do them. It really comes down to self. And in that way, we're ruled by sin, even if we don't want to acknowledge it, even if we don't want to believe that's the reality. We want to think we're good and we're right. But yet, living in that world, we live for ourselves, we live for our own happiness. And that kind of world functions, and we live in this world quite often. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you worse. That's the world that we sometimes live in. We desire to be strong, right? Not weak. We desire to be the hero, not the martyr. We desire to be merciful, but when it benefits me. We desire to never be wrong, always be right, to decide our own future, indebted to no one. Paul says that's who you are without Christ. Yet that's not reality. Larry, can you hit the next slide? What we encounter is, and you get this from the Old Testament picture, not just the New Testament picture, but God's kingdom, God's realm, God's rule, and the world we live in do interlock. They overlap. They always did. Limited to God under the old way. And it's not until Jesus comes, Larry, you can hit the next one, that all of a sudden this access is opened up and the kingdom is really moving in a big way into the world we live in. Even now, as we speak, that's what Jesus kicked off, inaugurated, as the fancy way theologians say it. Sin is a poison in the world we live in, but God, through Jesus Christ, is taking care of that. And it's happening in our very midst right now. And we can have access to God right now. And Jesus asks us to come to him and be resurrected, to find new life in Jesus Christ, and by that we enter into the kingdom of God. That's what's going on with resurrection. And it, among other things, that gives us a new perspective on the world around us and how God works in the world. It gives us a new perspective on how we interact with God, on how we relate to others, and yes, even how we care for creation. It changes all of that. There's a new ruler, there's a new reason that we live, there's a heart change, an obedient shift, a new love that we have. What we watch, what I hear, what I say, what I do, all get filtered through my love for God. The way of the old self doesn't go anymore. You can no longer just treat people however you feel like it. You treat them out of love because they're created by God. You can't push them off to the side. You can't hang up the phone at work. Came in and called blah, blah, blah. You can't do that anymore because they're created in the image of God, and we love them because God loved us and showed it on the cross. And that's only possible to have that world affected and utterly altered on the other side of resurrection. I'll give you one example of the alteration that goes on when we are essentially brought to new life in Christ. In previous church context I was in, I served as an associate pastor who did a whole host of things, but one of them was Ministries of Compassion, Mercy, and Justice. And we were working as a congregation to make sure that we were aware of what was going on with human trafficking and modern-day slavery in the world and what our response should be, because the church needs to have an adequate response, and we can do things. And after moving through a lot of the awareness components of that, one of my friends at the church took a business trip, as he often did, to another part of the world. And it was a part where this kind of stuff wasn't really hidden, but he wouldn't have really noticed it as much before, but now his eyes were opened. He comes back and he said, it was everywhere. It was all around me. The poor treatment of other humans around me, people who were indebted or enslaved, couldn't get out of their situation, and they were treated so poorly. He never would have seen it before, but his world had been utterly altered by the awareness part of it. That is a small component of what's going on and what's being altered in us when we find new life in Jesus Christ, when we are resurrected. Be full, not empty. Find the empty tomb. Find life in the resurrection. A couple of thoughts as we close this out. Maybe you're like one of the 66% we heard about at the beginning who believes that the death and resurrection actually occurred, but that's where it stops. Maybe you're one of the 77% who says, well, believing in Jesus makes a positive difference, and that's good to know, but that's where it stops. Maybe you're completely far back from that and you say, well, Jesus really never died, or Jesus really never resurrected because that's impossible. Wherever you are, that first point is your point. Find the empty tomb. I haven't given you a full picture of that this morning, but the historical record becomes clearer and clearer the more you actually dig into it. You can't just come to it and say, I don't believe in resurrection, so it didn't happen. That's worldview. That's not considering what's before us, the record, which shows us a different picture. And if you have known Jesus Christ for 5 minutes or 50 years, it doesn't matter. Are you fully living resurrection now? None of us are. Be challenged, not just to find the empty tomb, but to find full life in resurrection, that new life that Jesus Christ gives. Let's take some time to pray right now. And I'm going to encourage you in this time. If burdens and doubts hold you back from God, if worldview holds you back from God, I encourage you to take a moment to just lay those before God right now. If sin holds you back from God, lay it down right now. God, through your Son, Jesus Christ, we can know new life. Let us lay down our burdens, our doubts, our fears, our concerns, our ignorance, our arrogance, our pride. The things that make us feel inflated in front of you and make you seem tiny. God, may you be big, may you be real, may your resurrection be powerful, as it already is. And may we realize what's going on in the world around us, that your kingdom is already coming, your will is already being done, and you are calling us to be a part of that. God, many in the room are called to be a part of that. I pray that your Spirit come in this place. I pray that they receive you now. God, be with us as we understand the love that you showed us on the cross and the power that you deliver through the resurrection. Be with us today. Amen.